What truly makes us connect with a story, a song, or a piece of art? In today's episode, I want to explore the overlap between creativity and AI. I want to ask if AI can ever truly replicate human creativity, or if there is something innately human that AI will never quite reach. I want to play with the idea of original thoughts and how that has an impact on plagiarism and copyright. So I'm going to dive into creativity, the value of things in general, our ever-evolving relationship with AI as humans, and try and play with some real-life examples of how this might impact all of us moving forwards. So, when you're ready, let's get into it. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Thinking Differently, a podcast designed to take an idea, pull it apart, and challenge the way that we think about it. I'm your host, Andy Franklin, and I'll be your guide through this sometimes wandering journey of exploration, which will hopefully leave you with more questions than answers and a lot to think about. Okay, disclaimer part, as always, I'll try and be as quick as possible. All of these thoughts are my own. I am not saying at any point that my truth is the truth or that there is ever one fully objective truth. Everything is subjective, and so your truth might be different to mine, and both of those things are okay. Plus, I'm not saying that my truth is the truth that I'm going to hold in the future, because hopefully, given new information, I will be able to adapt and change my view on the world to better expand my knowledge as well. Any generalizations that I make as part of this episode are my generalizations. They are my shorthands, and I am at no point dismissing the nuance that might be under those generalizations, which other people might be more aware of. And finally, I'm not here to give you your answers. Only you can do that. I'm only here to bring things up from my subconscious into my conscious, to play around with them and hopefully explore them in more detail so I can understand my own feelings and cognitive biases about those. Hopefully it might do the same for you. So with all that said, let's move on to this idea of AI and creativity. So first, some terminology to get that out of the way. When I'm talking about AI in the context of this episode, I'm talking about the AI which is really prevalent in the news and in everyone's awareness at the moment, which is normally large language models. So things like ChatGPT, Gemini, and all of the others that are popping up, including that Microsoft one that nobody remembers and can't remember the name of. And what these are in simple terms is data processing models. They ingest a huge amount of data and then they're able to respond in a human-like way, either through speech or images or text or music. So what I want to explore is what creativity is and why we as humans, and me personally, love creativity so much. I think there is an incredible joy that we get through experiencing the world through somebody else's eyes. And I think art and creativity in general is one of the only ways that we can really do that. There's something incredible about the shared experience of life, which is captured through creativity and art. The incredible emotive response that I get to a specific set of song lyrics, or an image that I see, or when I'm listening to an incredible story, or when I hear someone express something that I've been thinking in a book, gives me a sense of oneness with that creator. It gives me a sense that my internal world is reflected outside of it. It gives me a sense that my internal world is reflected out in the external world. And that gives me a sense of connectedness, community, and shared experience. It makes me, as an individual human, feel less alone in the world. And I think that's one of the reasons that creativity and art and music are so beautiful to us. There's also an incredible spark of wonder for me in just imagining that another human being could have created this thing, that they could have, from their brain, pulled all of these different threads out from their own experience, to create something truly magical which didn't exist before. And so with all of those things, I wonder whether we lose that joy, that ability to connect, if we know that the thing is created not through another human's experience, but actually the consolidation of lots of human experiences, which has been pushed through a computer program to give us the most realistic copy of that thing. But then the question that comes up a lot at the moment is, how will we know? So I think for me personally, you probably do lose that connection. If I see that something is generated by AI, I am automatically slightly less connected with that thing, even though the thing might be just as valid, the song might be just as poignant, the story might be just as gripping. I detach from it a little when I realize that it's been created by AI. And I wonder whether that is the thing that I was talking about before around the joy of shared experience. It's like internally, I feel like at the moment, there is still this fakeness about it. It's going through the steps, but it's not really understanding. And I think maybe that's the same in the human condition as well. I think we naturally have an ability to tell the difference between somebody who is saying all of the right things and somebody who has internalized those ideas and are speaking from their point of truth. So maybe this AI thing is almost like the difference between knowledge and understanding. AI has the ability to amass knowledge. It has the ability to consolidate lots of information through wave patterns in music or through naturalized speech patterns or text patterns in stories. It has the ability to really accurately mimic what we're doing. But that's still knowledge, and it's not understanding. It's not that deep sense of knowing that I feel like as humans, a lot of the time, we have an innate ability to recognize. So I guess the next question is, can AI be creative? So I was having a really interesting conversation with a friend of mine about this who works in the music industry. And we were talking about the plagiarism of other people's music in order to generate a song. And his argument was that the AI was taking all of that information and it was stealing all of the artist's ideas and then it was shoving them all together in order to create something which was just a bastardization of what the artist had created. My argument was that we as humans do exactly that. What we do is we ingest lots of different sources of information and then we smush them all together when we're creating. So what is the difference between a computer program doing that and a human doing that? If I listen to lots of Stevie Wonder songs, then any music that I write will be influenced heavily by the work of Stevie Wonder. What is the difference between us doing that as humans and a computer program doing that in possibly a much more accurate way than we could? And that's kind of the point that we ended in that conversation, because we were trying to also manage 4 screaming children late at night in a pub while eating pizza, and we didn't really have time to get into it in any more detail. But since then, I've thought about that in a little bit more detail. And I think that the difference is subjectivity. I think potentially the difference here is that because of subjectivity, because everything that we as humans individually experience in life is fed through the filter of our own experience, of our own sensory perception of the world. There is no way we can ever truly replicate somebody else's work. Even if the only thing I listened to was a single Stevie Wonder song, I still wouldn't be able to replicate that Stevie Wonder song. Because if I was going to try and create something being inspired by that music, I would automatically put my own experience into it. And my experience would be completely different to somebody else's experience. And so I think potentially the difficulty and the difference when AI does that is it actually can replicate 100% that original material. And because of the fact that it doesn't have its own ability to apply subjectivity, it means that whatever the AI creates, it is always a copy and is not original. Potentially, originality is the ability as humans to apply a subjective lens to the experience of being human for us specifically. And then the creativity that flows from that is us feeding back into the outside world our internal view. So I guess what I'm saying is creativity is the ability to apply multiple things at the same time to create something new, something nuanced. The ability to connect disparate ideas into a new form. And because AI doesn't have lived experience, it doesn't have its own view on things, it can never truly replicate creativity in the same way as a human could. Now, that's not to say that the AI generated stuff isn't incredible. It absolutely is very good at replicating what we create. And although at the moment we can probably still tell by looking at an image or looking in detail at the construction of a song whether or not it's AI generated. But over time, and I don't think it's that long, it will be able to replicate the failings and the inconsistencies of humans in the same way that humans do. So the example that I would give here is most AI generated music. The sound is too clean. It's too pure. There's not enough variance in it. So everything sounds a little bit auto-tuned. But then I don't know whether that's because the models training this AI have been trained on mainly auto-tuned music of the last 20 years and not the rawer, purer stuff from earlier in time. So then we get into the question about how AI is trained. And the way that I understand it is basically it just ingests a huge amount of data. It's just really good at synthesizing a huge, disparate set of information and analyzing it at its most basic level in order to generate something which is human in appearance. So the more information it gets, the more data it receives, the better and more lifelike the AI is, because it has more ability to apply the nuance which is human. So if AI is being trained on other people's creativity, then is it stealing that creativity off other people? And I think maybe at this point, I just want to tap into copyright law and things like that, and who copyright law is meant to protect. So the idea of copyright law has been around in its now form since about the 1700s, and it's kind of evolved through time since then. But only recently have the contracts started having an AI clause in them to say you are not allowed to use my copyrighted material in order to train AI models. Now, that's not to say that the stuff that was there beforehand is allowed to be used that way. I just don't think AI existed in this way, so it was therefore never put into copyright. So who does copyright protect and who is it meant to protect? Because I think there's a balance to be struck here in that when copyright was created, it was created to protect the intellectual property of the person who created the thing, the person who was creative. So it was to stop someone having a really good idea and then everybody else stealing that idea. And so it was definitely to protect the individual, the person creating. And then it kind of got co-opted by the corporations. So then copyright law changed in order to also make sure that the large-scale corporations who make a lot of money off this material are then protected. And while that feels moral and just, or at least for the individual part, I think there are also areas where potentially the challenge of copyright is the fair usage clause. So the idea that you cannot copyright everything. You can't copyright an idea. You can only copyright your opinions based on that idea. So what am I saying here? I think I'm saying that copyright in general is probably a positive thing if it continues to be a tool of protection for the creator, but that we need to ensure that copyright doesn't lean itself more towards protecting the people who make the most money rather than the people doing the creating. And so each creator should have their own ability to say whether or not they want their material used in order to train other models. And they should probably get paid based on that usage. If we look at music again as an example, so if we look at Napster, that was the first proper online distribution for music, but the creators who were coming up with that music and putting their time and effort into that music weren't getting paid. So the creators were losing out by Napster distributing their material without paying them. And I think generally there is a consensus that if you do something and people benefit from that thing, then you should be paid accordingly for that thing unless you agree to give away that thing for free. But it's your choice as a creator, as a human, whether or not you want to do something and give it away for free, or whether you want to do something and be paid for that thing. And I think that's when Napster took the control off that person who was thinking that they were doing something in order to get paid for it and was giving it away for free anyway. Spotify now does definitely give some of the money back to the creators. But again, there are layers within that that I don't have the time or knowledge to go into about whether or not, because everything is streamed through that platform ends up making a lot more and the creator ends up making a lot less than they used to. And whether or not that's fair, because then the creator's music gets to a wider audience, or whether actually the corporation behind Spotify are now taking advantage of the artist because the artist doesn't have a choice but to publish on Spotify because Spotify is now so large that if they don't, then they won't get the distribution that everybody else will. Going back to training the models, the other thing is where that information comes from and the validity of that information. So if there was enough incorrect or false information, misleading information, which the AI was ingesting, could that potentially shift the balance of that AI to then generate more incorrect or false information? And the more it generates, the more we ingest that, it could potentially lead us down a spiral of misinformation. And then also on the training point, could the information that's available to train these models then permanently and substantially shift the way that we are as humans in a larger way? In the same way that text messages on a mobile phone shifted the way that we use language, the way that we communicate to each other now is different to 40 or 50 years ago based on the advent of text messages. And even within my lifetime, the way that we communicate has changed based on the availability of the type of text message you send. So when I was growing up and I had my first mobile phone, you got 140 characters as a text message, and you had to make sure that all of the information that you wanted to send was crammed into those 140 characters, because it cost 10p to send every text message, and you didn't want to spend 20p sending one because you were a few characters over. Compare that to now, the way that I tend to use WhatsApp or Signal or something like that, which is more of a stream of consciousness. I will send 5 or 6 messages of a sentence apiece at the same time and then receive the same in response. It's very rare that I get a really long articulated message in a single message from someone. So in the same way, the way that we talk about social media being a potential echo chamber if you only follow people with like-minded views to you, could AI do the same thing where you end up losing some of the nuance through the ideas being rechurned into a construct where the data it's then ingesting is generated by itself and not from an original source? And again, all of this has already existed within human history. This kind of stuff naturally happens in English, especially in the English language. It's a hugely bastardized language from lots of other different sources. We've got a little bit of Latin in there, we've got a little bit of French, we've got a little bit of Germanic. All of these things kind of crushed together to create this really complicated language for everybody else to learn, because we have adapted over time to all of those new inputs. So is the issue here not that we're going to adapt, but for the first time potentially we're not feeling like we're in control of that adaptation? That adaptation might happen to us rather than something which we are choosing. But then you could argue that that's always been the case. The English language didn't choose to adapt. It was normally based on a new conquering army coming in and that influence changing the way that we speak. If you are interested in my views on control in general, you should check out, I've got a separate episode on control where I go into this idea in a little bit more detail. So perhaps the nuance here is understanding that AI is not a creator, but it is a tool. And it is okay for humans to use tools to better advance their skill. So what I mean by that is AI is really good at condensing a huge amount of information. It's really good at structuring things, taking the essence of all of these complicated nuance points and bringing them all together. Taking the essence of all of these beautiful nuanced points and bringing it all together. But it still relies on human input, both in terms of the creativity at the beginning and also on the way that the question is framed. So I've got a great example of this. I was trying to use ChatGPT to write a hypnobirthing blog for my wife. And the title was 10 Misconceptions About Hypnobirthing. So the idea was that all of the challenges that people had to hypnobirthing would be worked through. Because my wife at the time was a hypnobirthing teacher, and so I was trying to dispel some of the myths. And so this all went really well. ChatGPT gave me 10 beautiful answers that could have just been put into a blog post, but there was one that I wanted to include which was missing. So I typed in, please give me one more bullet point about why hypnobirthing is dangerous for this reason. And what I meant is obviously why that is a misconception which doesn't pan out. But because of the way that I phrased the question, the answer that I got was talking about how risky it was to do hypnobirthing as part of your birth. And then all I had to do was rephrase the question to say, no, give me that as a misconception. And it completely flipped the thing that it was saying. So the question, the way that you ask something to the model is incredibly important for the response that you get. And so that ability to ask the right questions and understand the nuance of the answer is going to become really important. But going back to the point, I think that AI could be used as an incredible catalyst to spur on human creativity. So what I mean by that is artists can start using AI to support their work as opposed to generating it on its own. In the same way that you wouldn't have been able to be a writer 200 years ago if you couldn't spell. But now you can use a word processor and the spelling is done for you. So there is now no longer a limitation of being a writer with the idea of having to be able to spell the words. Unless you're like me, and then sometimes even the spell check doesn't know which word I'm trying to spell because it's spelled so badly wrong. But that's an aside. So we can look at examples of this through history already. So the Industrial Revolution was a massive shift where the people who worked on the looms and who crafted material things were kind of displaced by this machinery that could do it for them. So the question was, where was the creativity there? Was the creativity in designing the thing in the first place, or was the creativity in making the thing? And at what level do those two things cross over? At what level does one turn into the other? If I write a short synopsis of a book idea and get ChatGPT to generate all of the book, was that my creative idea? Or is it relying too heavily on the information that ChatGPT has stored in its information bank that it's not really mine anymore? It's been abstracted too far away. Whereas the idea of me writing an entire 100,000 word book and then spinning it through ChatGPT to say, is there any grammatical fixes that you would put in here? Or is there any way that you might want to restructure this so it made more sense? Is a completely different question. So in order to be really meta, I actually asked an AI model the answer to what the difference was. And it said, inspiration for a human is a subjective, interpretive, and creative process, while for AI, it is a synthetic, large-scale, data-driven process. The primary distinction lies in the intent, control, and capacity for originality. Humans process inspiration in a way that is personal and transformative, while AI processes data systematically, potentially raising ethical and legal questions over the fairness and originality of its work. So you could argue at this point that AI has just expressed everything a lot better than I could, but it was using my original ideas before it generated that answer. And so given that AI is probably here to stay, the next thing that I started playing with is whether or not over time we will change the way that we value skills. And what I mean by that is now you don't necessarily have to be a master of your craft in order to create something. AI can be the master. And so it's your job to do the ideation. It's your job to create the ideas rather than practice a skill for a really long time. Rather than having to be a specialist in a certain field, it takes us to a place where our creativity can be purer because some of the legwork can be done by something else. And so the example that I would give on this is the chess example. So chess, originally, a human was better than a computer. And then over time, a computer became better than the human because chess is a very predictable game. And so a computer naturally got the upper hand. And yet now what they've discovered is a human and a computer working together are better than a computer or a human on their own. And that's because while the computer can quickly analyze the data, process hundreds of thousands of potential moves in order to come up with the 3 or 4 best ones, the overall strategy and approach is better seen by the human. And so as long as the human has a basic understanding of the way that chess works and their ideas moving forwards, the computer can do the hard work of the part that previously a human would have had to memorize in order to get as many possible move options and work out their potential benefit. The computer can run through all of those scenarios in super speed time and just say, hey, overall, these ones look the best. And so I wonder how this then impacts on the changing landscape of education and the way that we all understand the world. The fact that if the skill sets that we now need are more around generating ideas and problem solving and critical thinking, whether or not that will change our education system and the way that we view value as not being something that is created by the amount of time you've been doing something, but actually more about your overall understanding of that thing and how it can be applied to multiple areas at once. The crossover might end up being more important than the specialization. The book Range by David Epstein is a brilliant book on this. The idea within that book is that specialization is really important, but true creativity comes from generalists. It comes from the Steve Jobs who both understands the world of computers, but is also able to do a calligraphy course and understand the impact and importance of design. That collaboration of those two things was what made Apple such a success. But then I think I also probably have to highlight the risk of the over-reliance on AI. The more we move to abstract ourselves from certain parts of a process, the more difficult it is for us to understand the detail. And that does leave us with an area of vulnerability. Recently, I went to get the car serviced and I went to pick up the car, and instead of it being £300 to £350 for the service like they quoted, it was £450. And I questioned it, and because I don't know a lot about cars, I don't really know anything about it, the mechanic came in, sat there nonchalantly and said, oh, it's because you've got really expensive oil. And so I kind of questioned that because we've had the car service before and it's never really been a problem before, but he was adamant that it was because the oil that they put into the car was £150 worth of oil. And I didn't have the knowledge or experience to really challenge that. I didn't know whether what he was saying was true or not. So what I ended up doing in that situation is basically just standing there for a really long time questioning it, and then doing some quick Google research on how much this oil was meant to cost. And eventually one of the senior mechanics came in and he noticed that I had been charged for 4.5 5-litre containers instead of 4.5 litres of oil, right? So a complete oversight on their part based on the fact that they just typed in the wrong number. But I'd have been able to spot that. I'd have been able to spot that instantly if I'd have known that a car doesn't take 25 litres of oil, which I probably could have worked out, but because I'm so abstracted from the process, it's not even something that I would have thought about. And it would take me much longer to realise that actually 25 litres is a huge amount of oil to put into a car, as opposed to if we still really understood the mechanics of a car, if we still did the services ourselves at home, like I used to do with my dad on the drive, I think he would have noticed that error instantly because he understood more about the car that he was driving. So there is a risk that as we move more away from the operation of these things, the more abstracted they become, the more risk we potentially have of losing that nuance and not understanding the thing in enough detail. So we probably do need to find a balance between the freedom from the mundane tasks, the freedom from the huge amount of legwork in order to understand something in enough detail to be a master or an expert, while still holding on to that critical eye of a consumer, of an individual, to make sure that we're not losing the nuance that we previously would have understood. So then thinking about the future, at the moment, it very much feels like we're being swamped with AI content. And I think that's probably twofold. One, it's quite a new technology, and two, it's because people can't necessarily identify between the two. And there's no structure, there's no limitations to say you're not allowed to post AI content here. The one example that I've seen where they have started introducing that is in Amazon. In the Kindle section, you now have to say whether it is AI generated content or whether it is AI assisted content. And they make it very clear in their rules what the difference between the two is. If the AI has generated the text, then it is AI generated content. If the AI has helped you restructure the text that you've already written, then it is AI assisted. But either way, if you are using AI, you have to tell them. I think we might end up in a situation in the future where that happens on everything. You have to have a watermark based on whether or not it is generated by AI or generated by a human or a combination of the two. And I think that will also help with all of the spread of misinformation. I remember looking at Midjourney about a year ago, which is an AI image generator, and the amount of political rhetoric that I was seeing being generated. So at the time, there was some political issues in France, and I saw one image that was being generated of Macron, the president at the time, riding through the center of France through a riot on horseback. And I can imagine that most people would have looked at that and seen it as an AI generated image. But the risk now is that these AIs are so good that you could use that to fuel the fire of misinformation. It could be used to stir up a riot about how out of touch that person is with the people. And so I think there probably is a need with the advent of AI, with it being so incorporated now into our world, that we need some way of distinguishing between the two. Now, some might argue that the cat is already out of the bag and there's no benefit for the AI companies to do this. But I think there probably is a benefit for the humans to do this, which should really drive the change. Or maybe it'll work more like computer viruses. Maybe there will be a constant shifting battle between the virus and the virus protection software, that as quick as the AI gets better at generating lifelike, human-like content, the AI detection tools will end up getting better at spotting that content, about spotting the tiny nuances that make it obvious that it's AI generated and not human generated. Or maybe we'll get to a point where we can't tell the difference. But I guess the question is still, whose responsibility is that? Is it the big companies who are allowing us to share that information? Is it the AI generation software whose responsibility it is to protect the human race and the people and creativity? Or is it the individual's human's responsibility? And I think depending on where humanity ends up landing on that, it could make a massive difference to the way that we go in terms of how creativity as an art form is respected and understood and valued as a society. So that's probably all I've got to say about that at the moment. Again, this is an ever-changing field. I am sure by next week, my views on some of this may have changed, but I would be really interested in knowing how you feel about creativity. Are you a creative who is worried about your job or your mastery being lost to AI and generic content? Or are you someone who has been able to express yourself freely using your creativity, but using AI as a tool to allow you to express that creativity in a way that you couldn't previously? All comments welcome. Again, as I always say, please be respectful of everybody else's views. We all have our own views. We're all coming from our own opinion and everything is valid. as long as we are kind and respectful and open to other people's opinions. And the final question that I would probably pose to you to try and answer is, how do we preserve the art of human creativity? How do we capture the essence of human creativity and not lose that while still applying all of the new tools and skills and ability to process at our disposal, and not shut down the whole idea because it's scary? I think there's a big shift coming in the way that we understand value. And so I'm really interested to see how that plays out. And with that, I'll leave you for today. Thank you so much for listening, and take care.